All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple minutes as folks log in, but you're welcome to drop your name, organization, pronouns, and location in the chat while we wait to get started. Thank you for being here. If you've just joined, we are giving it a minute or two as people get online, but feel free to drop your name, organization, location, pronouns in the chat, and we'll see where everybody is coming from and get started here shortly. Thank you, everyone who has joined so far. Feel free to drop your name, organization, pronouns, location in the chat. We will also be monitoring the Q&A section and the chat for questions throughout the webinar. So you're welcome to drop those as we go, and we will take them at the end. And we will get started here in just about a minute. Thank you for your patience. All righty, we are going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for being here today. As folks are joining, feel free to drop your name and organization, as well as any questions you have throughout the duration of the call, and we will make sure to take them at the end. But welcome to our webinar, reflecting on federal community benefit plans and talking about this framework for energy justice that we believe was partially realized and lessons to learn for the future. My name is Evelyn Mayo. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Initiative for Energy Justice. And to start us off, I'll provide some brief context on energy justice, what federal community benefit plans are, as well to give context to our conversation today. And then we'll jump into our awesome panel of speakers, wrapping up with our Q&A. As I said, you're welcome to drop them in the chat as we go or just hold them until the end. Advance policy that centers on energy justice, it's critical that communities experience material benefits from the energy system itself, and they actually have decision-making authority over energy infrastructure. Benefits could include monetary payments, pollution remediation, infrastructure investment, job programs, health improvements, and so much more. Policy interventions that account for, track, and allocate benefits are key to this policy change. Some countless strategies and structures attempt to center community decision-making and benefits with as many successes, failures, and lessons learned. IEJ researches and evaluates these structures to supply our partners with the necessary tools and knowledge to design policy interventions and apply best practices in community benefits allocation and democratic governance structures. We've been researching and writing on the ways that community benefits can and should be integrated in energy infrastructure for several years, and have all of these resources available on our website if you're interested. The focus of this year's research was on federal community benefit plans in the Department of Energy funded projects launched during the Biden-Harris administration. We wanted to know where the projects stood after the Trump administration's attack on clean energy, on environmental justice, on community benefits, and DEIA. We also wanted to know if the initial program design and implementation itself had lived up to these Justice 40 promises that have been made to communities. So many of y'all may be familiar with community benefit agreements, but a community benefit plan is slightly different. We believe a community benefit plan can, and we believe should, lead to a CBA, but it is different in that it's not legally enforceable. It's based on commitments. And this CBP, however, was part of the requirements in the DOE's grant applications. So the applicants essentially had to describe how their project aligned with Justice 40 to flow spending to disadvantaged communities, and by detailing how their activities would promote these four pillars: community and labor engagement, investing in the American workforce, and promoting DEIA. We welcome you, of course, to read the full brief, which we can share in the chat and after the presentation. But here are some of the key takeaways that we'll be discussing further with our panelists today. First, we want to recognize that it was and is a good thing for community benefits to be integrated in DOE grant making and programs. This is, we think, a critical and necessary first step to realize benefits on the ground. But to that end, there were significant differences in how each DOE office implemented their CBP frameworks. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but it illustrated the different ways that the benefits were integrated, and the panelists can each share their experiences with some of those methods. Most importantly, however, we believe that the CBP framework fell short in ensuring that those most impacted were involved in the development and enforcement of CBPs. We also think that they should be made legally enforceable through other benefit mechanisms and ensure that project funding be contingent on benefit implementation and evaluation. Now, to dive into these concepts a little more, I'm excited to introduce our expert panelists. Sonrisa will be joining us shortly, but she was a special advisor for stakeholder engagement in the Office of Energy Justice and Equity, where she actually led DOE-wide efforts to integrate community voices into DOE decision-making and built trusted relationships with impacted communities on the front line of the energy system. Previously, she was the Equitable Buildings Decarbonization Manager at RMI, where she led efforts to integrate equity into carbon-free building policy and advocacy. She also worked to advance equitable sustainability and climate policy at the City and County of Denver in the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Welcome, Sonrisa. Next, we have Daniel Rossi-Keene, who is the Executive Director of Riverwise. Riverwise exists to organize community power and voice so that residents can assert agency over the future of Beaver County, Pennsylvania. Daniel has served on the boards of more than 30 nonprofit and civic organizations. He teaches regularly at colleges and universities around the regions and writes a regular column entitled Community Matters for the Bridge. Thank you for being here, Daniel. Next, we have Megan Nibler. Megan has been creating, implementing, and evaluating community-based programs since 2008. Her career started as a birth doula and home visitor, which led her path and passion towards reproductive and sexual health education. Her work has included developing and implementing sexuality education curriculums for families, facilitating community-based breast and cervical health education, and directing support programs for postpartum families with complex needs. Since coming to Fair Shake in 2021, Megan has seen how the same systems that impact reproductive justice impact environmental justice, and she loves to help communities strategize and pull legal, policy, and organizing levers to move their vision into action. Thank you for being here, Megan. And last but certainly not least, we have Justin, who is currently serving as the Director of the Affiliated Construction Trades, part of the West Virginia Building and Construction Trades Council. His work centers on advocating for the skilled construction workforce through policy, education, and strategic partnerships. Justin leads a small but mighty team focused on supporting local unions, ensuring fair wages and benefits, promoting job site safety, and protecting public investments. Before ACT, he served as an attorney for the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 132. Thank you for being here, Justin. All right. So we've heard who's going to be talking. Now let's hear their voices. To start us off, anyone can jump in first. I would like to hear from you about how you were brought to community benefit plans, how your organization's connected, your personal work with it, just a brief overview, if you would. Megan, why don't you kick us off? Or Justin, I see you just came off mute. Go ahead.
Sure, I can start. So I said Justin Williams with the Affiliated Construction Trades in West Virginia, and we represent construction union workers across the whole state. So we have work in all types of construction, industrial, commercial, and some residential. But my work with community benefits plans and community benefits agreements comes through kind of twofold in this situation that we're talking about, some of the DOE money, both one through the infrastructure money on a solar project that was going to be on a abandoned landmine, so a strip mine job in pretty rural part of West Virginia with a fairly sizable developer that we had worked with on some other projects. And so we had an ongoing relationship with them, and they came to us as they were developing their application to engage with us, as well as a few other local organizations in the area, the community technical colleges, and some others. We were also engaged with the Appalachian Regional Hydrogen Hub in West Virginia. So one of the other, hydrogen projects, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more as well in this. But so that's kind of the basis there of how we got to engage in those. And this is something that we do on a pretty regular basis, engage with developers of projects to, for our focus, try to get them to use local West Virginia workers for the construction of all types of projects, whether it be energy or otherwise. But energy is as far as West Virginia, it's a big portion of the work that we do in West Virginia. We've done everything from working in the coal-fired power plants to building every windmill in West Virginia. So we're agnostic to the energy source, but I like to tell people that our members are cover the spectrum politically. So these projects are always interesting when it comes to conversations with members, but our members first and foremost are West Virginians, and so they do care about their communities. And I think that's really a big piece of what makes my job as good as it is I really get to represent the people that are in those communities on a daily basis. So I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Justin.
I can hop in next. Hi, everyone. So nice to meet you. I'm Megan Niebler. I'm with Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services. We are an environmental law and justice nonprofit, so we provide no-cost and low-cost legal representation to individuals, to coalitions, to municipalities, to grassroots groups throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. I am not a lawyer. I get to work very closely with them, but I work on part of our program that helps support communities and environmental justice communities to really find legal, policy, and organizing levers across our region. And as an organization, we really are community and client driven, which means the goals of community become the goals that we are there to support them with. And so really through that lens, community benefits has really been an area that we have been supporting communities on for really forever, but the past 4 to 5 years with a little bit more emphasis. And so part of the reason for that is that it's one of the only levers that gives community coalitions legal accountability. Usually that's held by the municipality, but community benefits can kind of shift that power. And through that work, we've worked very closely with Riverwise, which I'm sure Daniel will share more about, to do some proactive community education and capacity building. And then currently, we also provide a lot of technical assistance and legal representation around community benefit agreements, ordinances, and other kind of mechanisms around community benefits. Within the realm of community benefit plans, kind of that was one of the umbrella ways that we were supporting community benefits. In our work, it was most aligned with the region's hydrogen hub that Justin mentioned. And so in that work, we did a lot of direct engagement with community groups in towns that the hydrogen hubs were being proposed for. We did a lot of liaisoning with DOE around what the community was thinking about, the concerns, their responses, and then worked with a small coalition, meeting multiple times with DOE to provide our recommendations, share our concerns around how the CBP process was rolling out, and the recommendations that we had in terms of how can they best address community concerns within the CBP world. So I'm sure we'll dive all into that in just a few minutes, but really happy to be here and just kind of reflect on that time period. It feels like a long time ago that we were having these conversations, so it's nice to revisit it.
Thank you, Megan. Go ahead, Daniel.
I'll jump in next since Megan and I kind of dovetail together in different ways. So I live in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, just north of the city of Pittsburgh. And that means that I live near one of the largest industrial developments in the nation in recent memory, a $15 billion Shell petrochemical facility. And Riverwise emerged really in the shadow of that project. And there was this wide and palpable sense that like these things were happening in our community, and our communities didn't really know how to be a part of the energy, the excitement, the concern, the decision making. And so those were the early days of some of Riverwise founding, when the community benefits process emerged in the public consciousness, more broadly. It felt like the kind of conversation that we needed to be a part of, particularly because of our recent past. And so Riverwise, as we often do, sort of like stuck our nose in and started figuring things out after the fact. We were also engaged at that time with developing a number of community projects. And so there was really this interplay between community project development of all kinds and community preparation for more inclusive and engaged participation in these various sorts of proposed, hypothetical future real development sorts of projects. And so we worked closely with Megan and her team at Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services. For 2 years, we stood up what we were calling a community benefits coalition. And it was really, in one way, it was just sort of base level community organizing. In another way, it was really trying to grow the community's imagination and preparation for something that may or may not actually materialize in their future. Had a number of community events, did a number of education kind of gatherings, ultimately rolled that all up into a document called the Guide for Community Benefits in Southwest Pennsylvania or something like that. Maybe we can share it in the link. Also was able to participate in a couple different events with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics. And all of that was, maybe ironically enough, never materialized in the participation in a formal community benefits planning process. Again, we'll talk about this maybe later. We had organization or projects reach out to us that didn't ultimately decide they were interested in working with us. I would conceive or conceptualize everything that is in a sense pre-development work. It was community preparation, lots of benefits from that, lots of challenges, and maybe we'll dig in, but I guess I can leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Daniel. And Sonrisa, you may have been logging on, but if you could just share how CBPs were connected to your work.
Yes, absolutely. And I apologize. I hope you don't hear too much background noise. I'm out at Starbucks. I just found out this morning that we're going to have a planned power outage in my neighborhood to prevent wildfires due to high winds. So, yes, climate change. But hello, everybody. My name is Sonrisa Lucero, and I was at DOE for about almost 3 years. I was in the Office of Energy, Justice, and Equity that was formerly named the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, which was responsible for developing the CBP framework for DOE in partnership with other program offices and other leaders around the DOE. We had, well, let's see, there was so much to say about all of that, but It was quite a wild ride time. If folks can remember, $100 billion, which is pretty much doubling DOE's budget, was allocated to them through both the bill, bipartisan infrastructure law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, and also the CHIPS Act. Those three combined gave roughly $100 billion to DOE to distribute out into clean energy across the country. There's also a few challenges within that as well, in that people may remember we all thought bipartisan infrastructure law was going to be dead. It started as the Build Back Better bill, and then that was pretty much effectively killed, even though we had an even split Senate. There were 2 senator holdouts on that bill that didn't allow us to pass it. And we came with a compromise that was something that Manchin could handle in the form of the the bipartisan infrastructure law. So that put a lot more emphasis on clean energy technologies that were less popular among community groups, such as hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration, and advanced small nuclear. And so that definitely changed the direction in which we were going to be doing our energy investment. But we did what we could to try and make sure that those projects, no matter what they were going to be built to some level of being able to support local communities, that the host communities where they were going to be sited, and to be able to be helping with wealth distribution to local communities that were also the host communities, so that it wasn't just a project that was coming in and kind of taking, just doing whatever it wanted, but it was going to try to avoid harms, especially in communities with high cumulative impact, and also distributing that benefit to those local groups. There's mixed reviews on how well we did on all of that. It depended on the project, it depended on the project teams, it depended on the community, and so on. And a lot of the projects, as you know, have now been defunded as well. So we won't really find out the impact of the efforts that we were doing with the CBPs and the CBAs. So my role in all of this was, one, I was helping, that the CBP framework was fairly well advanced by the time I joined DOE, but I did help with developing its rubric, how we would get merit reviewers into it. So we did try to get an equity reviewers into it, so it wasn't just project scientists or engineers that were reviewing the J40 aspects of the community benefit plan. So we tried to recruit from community to come and be the expert opinion and the scorers for the project. So I was supportive of that effort. I built the first draft of the scoring metric for how we would assign points based on those CBPs. And then I was responsible for the J40 rollout for DOE and getting that out into community, and then working in some of our most impacted communities across the state, or across the country rather, where we anticipated a lot of investment going into those areas. So I worked a lot in the Salton Sea, and I worked a lot in the Gulf South of Texas and Louisiana, a little bit in Pennsylvania, and then I was the DOE's primary liaison to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and so I tended to work with them and their recommendations that they had to the DOE on everything carbon management and hydrogen. And while I wasn't primarily focused on hydrogen on the ground, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration had a really robust staff that was doing that. I was often advising them in the background and working with them on the hydrogen hubs and in those areas. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the questions in the conversation.
Thank you, Sonrisa. So Daniel, you mentioned a lot of this was pre-development work, and Justin, you said you all have been doing benefit integration and energy projects for a while, but we also just heard from Sonrisa that a lot of this was work yet to be fully realized, and that's in the title of the report. So can anyone give us an example of an energy project that had community benefits integrated in it that you have experience with, whether it was a federal benefit plan or some other community benefit infrastructure?
From our side, I mean, we've done these types of agreements. It wouldn't necessarily be, community benefit plan in the same sense of all the community groups involved. It's been more labor specific, focused on every wind project in West Virginia. And so we work with the developers that say they will sign a project labor agreement to use, our local workers, our terms and conditions and wages for those types of projects. It's very succinct and what we're doing specifically for part of West Virginia is a regulated utility state, so they have to go through a Public Service Commission hearing to get a siting certificate. And so in that process, we often intervene to make sure that we get that opportunity to participate in those conversations and negotiations with the developer.
Thanks, Justin. And I think, Megan and Daniel, y'all had worked together on your community benefit, whole toolkit for the region. And labor and unions are known for having their terms and conditions, for working with them clear as day and use that as the leverage point to win contracts. Do you feel like the community benefit plan framework gave you all that space to create consensus with a larger group of community members for if and when an energy project does arise? Does that feel like a valuable takeaway from this experience?
It seems like we're staring at each other and smirking a little bit. So I'll jump in and then
we're
Daniel.
playing chicken over here.
Yeah. Yes. I think it's very clear from my perspective, the intent of CBPs was fantastic. And part of the reason for that is a lot of the work that we continue to do around community benefits is helping communities find the leverage that they need to even get a foot in the door. And so CBPs really did help communities at least see how they could put like a toenail in the door to be at the same table as the developers and the companies. So that is fantastic. And it started conversations that I think hadn't really happened, right? There can be a different way that developments can happen. And it was kind of a top down, like things can be different. And so I think from that perspective, the intent of CBPs, like I really appreciate it as someone doing kind of community organizing and strategy work directly with environmental justice communities. Daniel, what would you add to that from our work?
Yes to everything that Megan said, and I want to be very clear, given what I'm about to say, that I too applaud, the spirit and the intent of the process. I'll also just say that, like, this is coming from a place of, I haven't been at the table negotiating such a process. And so, take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, I suppose. The more deeply that I dug into, the whole pile of stuff, I guess, the more I felt like communities, for all of the virtuous aspirations of the process, communities still remained in a position of substantial responsiveness to priorities that were set outside of rooms that they did not have access to. They were also placed in environments where, there were unmanageable power differentials. Ragtag startup community coalition and the multinational corporation with, 1,700 attorneys on retainer working full time. It's not a very good setup. I think there was also deep challenges around the sustainability of the energy and the amount of work that would have been required to realize the vision of the community benefits planning process. I just talked about the 1,700 attorneys. There weren't resources or investments being made in the kinds of communities who ultimately would be asked to participate in negotiation around these kinds of benefits. And so there were a lot of really challenging dynamics that you all know well. I think we never got to the point where we, maybe mercifully, I don't know, we never got to the point where we had to see those things front and center. But I think it's important, in reflecting on this moment, both to celebrate as I said, the virtuous intent, and also to ask some pretty probing questions about what role it's fair to ask community stakeholders to play in those kinds of pre-baked power dynamics, and get much more honest and I think circumspect about what it would require to realize that vision in a more robust and sustainable kind of way. So maybe Megan was the good cop, I was the bad cop. I don't know, but there you have it.
It's all good. Well, I think you tee up the next question nicely. Sonrisa, you were actually one of the architects, and I think there's a big, everyone, especially given today's DOE, is so grateful for the intent and the emphasis and the resources diverted to trying to make this closer to a just situation. So can you tell us, what were the intentions? What do you want the public or advocates to know about this program and Justice 40 from your side?
Wow, thank you. What a, like, finally, right? We could say it. Yes,
You get your mic.
You get the mic. And also, like, yeah, it was funny because, like, when we were there, we were taking a lot of licks from the justice community for the way that CBPs were going, especially the WEJAC. I mean, I heard it all. And United Frontline, what was it? You get out for like just 6 months and you lose all your acronyms. But United Frontline Communities, I think it is. Anyway, we had a bunch of folks that would come at us pretty well. It's like, oh yeah, you guys, I was like, you guys don't realize how good we actually are. Like, come on now. But no, there was a lot that needed to be, that was wanting, and Daniel started to touch on it too. But the intention, you had a bunch of radical activists that were in the Office of Energy Justice and Equity that were trying to disrupt a procurement process. And really what we were talking about at DOE and all of this was a procurement process that has been developed over 50 years, that is safeguarded by lawyers and project managers and career feds. And at first, you want to dismiss a lot of them for their rigidity and their bureaucracy and all of that. And very quickly you realize that, yeah, you can have a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation that doesn't get awarded and all of a sudden they're suing you and your entire process is at risk, and not just the award that they're mad about, but maybe every other award that you've ever given. So just like the skepticism in our communities has been earned over years of mistreatment and broken promises, our bureaucrats within government have earned their stodginess for lots of reasons as well. Sometimes I feel like I should write a book of like in defense of bureaucracy, and we're seeing the need for it now more than ever. But in any case, what we were really trying to modify was a procurement process that has a lot of elements to it. The first and number one, like take you out at the kneecaps kind of element was that we could not introduce anything that was not initially in the FOA, or the funding opportunity announcement, which in every other federal department is called a NOFO, or notice of funding opportunity, for those that work with government a lot. And so if you didn't get what you wanted into that initial funding announcement, it was very difficult to change it. There were some amendment opportunities and we did take advantage of that, but it meant that your timeline was very much upfront, like your rules, your regulations get set up there. So by the time you've selected a project team, you can't really change the rules on the awardees. And so the community is pushing back and saying, hey, you should do this different, or something else needs to be on it. Our hands were fairly tied because we would have to restart the entire procurement process over and resend the FOAs out again and kind of start from the scratch. And so there are limited amendment opportunities and things like that, but it gets really complicated pretty fast. And DOE is also going against that cadre of lawyers, just like the others are. And quite frankly, you put even DOE negotiators in a room, and sometimes they're very much outmanned as well. So there's a learning process for a lot of us. And especially for brand new offices that get spun up, like Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. I want to dip my toe back into the last conversation a little bit. One place that there was different levels of success on the CBA development based on what the topic was and who the project teams were. So a lot of the solar and the community specific funded projects were having a lot of success and like forward movement on being able to develop for their CBAs or their CBPs rather. I don't want to really distinguish. The CBAs were a different beast. But the community benefit plans moved forward a lot better, and those projects, especially ones that were focused towards community development, and so a lot of our smaller awards did really great. One example of a big one, though, that it was doing and is still actually going is the lithium excise tax and lithium development in California. And so there's struggles there with different stakeholders and community groups and tribes that don't feel like their interests are being represented. But that process is still going forward. The state of California actually created a lithium excise tax that is redistributing benefit back to the local communities. They're still developing their plans. They hope to have agreements. They've created legal support for the local groups in the form of an ombudsman. And they are really trying to develop with local community training and the community colleges there to actually get the jobs to be local and to be able to work within that work. And so that's for lithium extraction. The biggest challenge there, of course, is the price of lithium internationally dropped really fast. And so a lot of the economics for lithium extraction modified. But that project, the means of extracting lithium in the Salton Sea is actually pretty environmentally friendly. There's some relatively environmentally friendly, and there's some real hope there, I think. But that might be a case study or an example of successful CBPs for people to look at, or at least marching along that process for a really big investment side, not just the small scale types of projects. But yeah, a lot of folks in the room that were working on the hydrogen projects, of course, you're going against the big, huge firms. It wasn't and where I was working a lot more on carbon capture and sequestration, it's big oil and gas. It's, Occidental and many other types of companies that Exxon and so on. And so that dynamic was very different than any of the others. But in any case, getting back to that intention part of it, it really was, we were trying to shoehorn everything we could into the CBP process that's modifying a procurement process, right? So you're trying to get, and the way it is that DOE is not funding, it's not building the projects themselves. You're really just subsidizing other projects, which I think is a big misunderstanding from the community at large. You have a name of Department of Energy. They think that we're out there building things or building, like the way Department of Transportation would be building a highway or something, right? Like we're not the ones contracting a particular project. We say we want this type of work to be done. Who wants to come in with 80% of the money to do it? And we'll give you 20% of the money. And so that actually limits the leverage that DOE has as well on a lot of these projects. So, and hydrogen and carbon capture, to be honest, weren't really the favorite projects of even these big oil and gas companies. In some ways, we were kind of twisting their arms to do these projects in the first place, and convince them to do it, which also meant that our leverage was also reduced in the negotiating room. Because they're like, well, if you guys don't like what we're doing, we'll just walk. And we're like, oh, well, we're actually trying to prove this technology and get this done. And so there was a strange dynamic in there too, that made things a little bit imbalanced. It wasn't like we're giving them permission to drill oil in a place that they've long coveted where they're going to be highly profitable. These are going to be projects that they're going to be marginally profitable at all. And then we were kind of talking them into doing it because they saw an opportunity for future industry or future market that maybe they would have a leg up in being a part of. And that industry was only going to happen in so much as people continued to put climate front and center, right? So in any case, that I'm just giving some background play on all of that. So then you try to put in the intentions that we had was to reduce really environmental harm. Our office was mostly interested in how do we reduce the environmental impact, the environmental harm on the communities. How do you do wealth creation for those communities? And how do you try to get some level of justice and solving past harms even into these projects? And so not CBAs or CBPs are only partially designed to be able to do that. We did as best as we could to put a Justice 40 aspect in there of making the project state how they would reduce harm from their project into or how would they into their CBP or into aspect of their application. And so that was a big element. But it was only scored maybe 5% of their overall score, as well as the other parts of the CBP. Or of that element, the Justice 40 element was only 5% of the overall score. There was another 15% for DEIA, for workforce engagement, and then if they were able to commit to the agreement element, that was worth another 5%. And so, but 20% for community-focused parts of it was brand new for DOE. There were a few program offices like Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy that had this program prior to this the Biden administration, but they would at most get 10% of their overall scoring to be in it. So really what we were trying to impact was the merit review process in the procurement. And so the whole point was the projects would rise to the top that had a better CBP development. That was also a challenge because 80% was still technical material. So just because you had an all-star CBP didn't mean you were going to get selected if your technical merit and your financial side of it wasn't great. And so we often CBPs were more of a decision maker for people on the bubble or kind of in that middle area than it was for your lead projects per se. And so as you got deeper into the procurement and the selection process, that's where the CBP made more of a difference. But mainly it became an element for us to kind of have a bully stick over the projects. Gets awarded. What DOE moved toward was how do we improve your CBP as much as possible and get it to be of a higher, more robust element. So even the big, technical teams that had the robust technical scores and maybe a mediocre CBP, we would work with them to try and improve that plan. And that's where a lot of the community engagement elements that people in this virtual setting started to get involved. Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations that had the hydrogen side mandated or tried as much as we could to mandate or to push the project teams to go and do community engagement in that negotiation period where they had been selected by DOE, but we hadn't signed ink yet saying that you were going to get the money and begin disbursements. And so there was a real wishy-washy kind of negotiation period where we were negotiating a contract with them, but we were also pushing them to hear from community and to change and adapt their community benefit plans during that process. The part that was really frustrating for everybody was that a lot of that negotiation process is done strictly between the project team and the DOE, and there's not a lot of non-disclosure agreements that get put into that part. So then the pure negotiation was behind closed doors and not with community groups to be able to say specifically what they wanted. There were some groups in California that tried to allow community groups to be negotiating, but they were behind an NDA, and democracy versus representation became a big argument in that project in California, where basically the community would have representatives, and the community representatives wanted to be able to be more open with the communities that they represented, saying, hey, here's the negotiations back and forth. We don't want to decide on your behalf. And that was prohibited because of the NDAs. And so you're seeing like this really kind of like battle of like democracy and rigid procurement policy. That was really difficult for us to get past, in particular because some of these companies had proprietary information, or at least they were able to claim that
Right.
to do it. So you ended up having DOE be somewhat of the advocates for the community behind the closed doors, but without being able to really discuss how they were doing that with community. So I could talk the entire time, so I'm going to stop and let you all go.
No, thanks, Andresa. And this is a lot of the meat and kind of nuts and bolts of the brief, these different ways that it actually went down. So I encourage you to, take a read if you're interested in hearing more. But I did want to ask, so Justin, you all were actually a named partner on a coal to solar granted project. Daniel, you all were more advocates on the outside in the context of the hydrogen hubs. Where do both of those projects stand today, and how does that impact your work around community benefits?
I can jump in. So the coal to solar one, it was technically funded through the Infrastructure and Jobs Act legislation, and it has since been frozen and is still not active. My understanding as of probably a couple months ago is that they were still trying to work through the process. But I am not, I don't project that it'll actually go anywhere at this point, at least not under that guise. I mean, there may be a future opportunity because the location is, as I mentioned, it's a abandoned mine land, and so there will be some other opportunities for some funding there, and it's a good location for this type of project, and they've looked at several locations in West Virginia, but the current environment is less driven to get one of those across the finish line at this point. So right now there's no offtake, to get construction on that project going anywhere.
And just a quick follow-up, Sonrisa made the good point that these are projects that are often 80% funded and the DOE is just the additional 20%. So are you still seeing energy development opportunities where you're leveraging labor benefits during this time, or it's just anything that DOE had its fingers in has kind of become ambiguous?
Well, I mean, yes. So that was funded a little bit differently through a grant with the Infrastructure Act, and then they were also relying on some of the tax credits for future usage, right? And so, kind of twofold into what they were, upfront capital versus long-term realization of the project and the tax credits. And what was stacked in that Infrastructure Act was you got increased tax credits for a coal community, or by using organized labor, or by having a community benefits plan or agreement, and other types of aspects. You could stack tax credits throughout the project. So not only were they the 20%, but they were also getting up to sometimes 40% investment tax credit over the length of the project. And so those have kind of been frozen as well, and taken off the table for the most part. And so that's kind of where, are there still projects like being worked and looking at? Yes. We're in the project process of a couple other, renewable-esque projects in West Virginia right now, some repowers and a new solar farm. And even within our regulated utilities, there's some solar work being done. But there is, more of an increase in the natural gas world that's not hydrogen driven, right? As Sonrisa mentioned, they kind of were looking at carbon capture with those projects, and now that kind of is phase 2 of natural gas, or they were going to use natural gas as the original feedstock for hydrogen. Technically, I guess the hydrogen hub still exists, but probably just in name and situation only, and they cut the community benefits part of the hydrogen hub. That contract no longer exists. It's just the other project development side of it.
Understood. Okay, well, Daniel, that's a perfect, and Megan too, if you have any insight on the hydrogen hub.
Yeah, I'll let Megan speak to the hydrogen hub point. She's been a lot closer to that. I will just say briefly, since the last federal election, that there have been a couple other interesting conversations that have emerged around larger scale clean energy projects with entities who still seem interested in something analogous to, or replicating some sort of community benefits planning process. Those conversations, I'm being cagey, but those conversations have actually been really interesting and way more in line with the spirit of what I think folks wanted the J40 ecosystem to be creating. I don't know if they'll go anywhere. We don't have anything signed at this point, but I do think, and this isn't at all really the question you asked, but I do think some of what was produced in this last handful of years, it created this desire for something different, and I think for a level of differentiation among corporate actors who actually see a market advantage to really truly moving forward with both the spirit and the reality of community benefits processes writ large. And so I do think there's some of those things coming. I hope there are. I want to be a part of those kinds of projects for sure. But the hydrogen hub stuff, I think, is a different kind of maybe casualty. I don't know. Megan can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much echoing what Justin said. From our knowledge, it's I mean, even before kind of funding was maybe terminated, and there's still like I'm saying that with a question mark at the end, because I think this points to the lack of transparency being a major problem really throughout the whole process, including the CBP creation, and then in that negotiation period. So I'm so glad you said that. We were part of the groups that did feel frustrated, right? Because we had some really good back and forth with DOE, and then they'd go back and they'd say, well, we tried to stand up for what y'all recommended, but we have NDAs we can't share out. And then what we were told back did not take any of our recommendations into account. And so another kind of instance of lack of transparency. And I think in our region, the Hydrogen Hub really painted the conflict that the CBP, across the board CBP, really put communities in, with a development that across the board, the community members, the residents that we were engaged with did not want these things. And we're kind of sick of large industrial promises that they didn't understand, that made promises that may not come to fruition, that, many had contaminated drinking water from these same companies who are now promising to be doing this new thing, right? There were companies with active permit violations that were then asking, being in communities saying, well, we have the CBP, so just trust us, right? And so all of those things really created a lot of conflict and challenge for communities to say, well, do we advocate against this thing, or is it a done deal? Do we not have any say in what comes to our community? And do we just rely on the CBP process that we are confused by, that we don't have capacity, knowledge, training, resources to help negotiate and be a part of? And so, when we think about kind of the larger extractive or industrial facilities and CBPs, it was a real challenge in the communities that we were working on to be part of that. So, coming back to your initial question, Hydrogen Hub is a question mark. And I think regardless of that, I think, again, we can still kind of learn a lot about when CBPs are kind of good fits and can really help spur projects on and communities to engage and help move those things forward, and when they might not be a good fit for the type of development that's being proposed.
That's a
Evelyn,
great point. Yeah.
Can I just, one interesting observation about the whole Hydrogen Hub CBP nexus? We had, I guess what I'll call an advocate for, major hydrogen hub proposal in our region, approach Riverwise at one point, and had some pretty interesting conversations. There was something really fascinating that emerged out of those conversations, though, and it's actually, I think, a really ironic kind of insight. Megan and I had been working with communities for a couple of years to try to position them to be as capable as possible to participate in this process. And it turned out, my takeaway from these interactions was that actually ended up being a liability. There was an inverse relationship between how thoroughly prepared our communities were to be a party to the conversation and how interested, in this case, this crew was in talking to that community. And nobody said this to me. My read on that is that there was a sense that we would be a harder, a less submissive kind of partner in that conversation. And so, I think the hydrogen hub conversation raised that in our region in a really interesting sort of way, and maybe an unintended consequence of standing up, community organization and power.
I think that's such a great point. And I know we're 5 minutes to the hour, and we have gotten one question from the audience. So if you do want your question to be answered, please go ahead and drop that in the chat or the Q&A. And it speaks to what has already kind of been touched on, in that often the planning is more important than the plan. Were benefits realized just going through the planning process? I know some of you all have touched on this, but tacking on my final question, what can we do now? What are you doing now? Should we not be over preparing, kind of to your point, Daniel? What should we be doing with our time from all your different perspectives, labor, former DOE and community advocates?
Well, I can jump in because I love that. And across all of our community benefit work, it's something that we are often supporting communities around is that the process of community benefits is usually more important than what's in the final written document. A good process that has the right people at the table, that gives meaningful decision making and is transparent back with the broader community, regardless of what's in that final document, folks feel good and can support the project when those things are met. And we've seen a final document that might have what looks to be beautiful benefits and protections listed in there, but if it wasn't a good process, the community is still not going to support that benefit or the CBA or the CBP or whatever it is. And so really emphasizing and thinking about creating a process that has the structure that, again, kind of brings the right people to the table, gives them meaningful decision-making power. And I think that's another kind of important thing that we learned throughout this process is that the CBP's definition of decision making and what the CBPs wanted from community was very different than the decisions the community wanted to have influence over, right? And so the companies often, typical example of like, here's a baseball field, what a great benefit, right? And we know that the CBP hoped to amp that up a little bit, but the communities really wanted influence on what is the technology that is going to be monitoring real-time air pollution, transparently sharing that out? How are they going to mitigate and monitor? And so those were things that were still left out of the CBP unless communities had a lot of power to be able to negotiate those things, which again, we didn't see in the ones that we were involved in. So I definitely think that process is more critical, and making sure that the process is set up to be really strong from the very beginning is critical.
I would agree, and I think the part of that is that maybe you were over prepared, but I think that's obviously an oxymoron in the sense that I think the more you can be prepared, and the longer the process goes, if the community is constantly doing that, I mean that's obviously that's what I get paid to do, but I'm constantly trying to work with these project developers, and you have to keep that process going because otherwise you get to the table later and later, and then it becomes less and less effective. And we definitely applaud in labor the administration and their effort to bring labor into these projects, hundreds of billions of dollars, and we've seen significant, particularly with chips and science and infrastructure money, and how that has been beneficial to communities and building careers out of the construction industry, and that's what we want from our perspective is the opportunity to build careers and provide for the communities. And so I think it has to be an ongoing, and we all can do a better job of communicating our positions, to similar organizations working in this to make sure that our communities are being beneficial. And I think we're better at that today than we probably ever have been. But it's still not where it probably needs to be. And so, I would think that, keeping that going, keeping that the front of people's minds, and then engaging your local government officials, right? So obviously federal officials and laws, but, if you've got the buy-in of, we see it all the time in West Virginia when they're going to shut down a coal power plant. Some county commissioners on the radio talking about the jobs. Well, we've got to be able to circumvent that argument with, yes, that's X amount of jobs, but when we do this and we engage the community, it's the same or more jobs potentially, and better jobs and a career for those folks. And so, engaging those people, so the way you have, that political cover, for lack of a better term, when it comes to those projects that may have, in coal country, a lack of, want, I'll call it, in some of those areas. And so that's really what we've been trying to do as well, is bring more people to the table, not just the community people, but the others, that on a regular basis.
I think one thing I'd love to add is just that, the investment in the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act were made and determined by Congress, right, by the legislature, and is very specifically line itemed out as far as like how that money was going to be spent. That is somewhat of a disconnect from how projects probably should be developed, right? Like it wasn't like what I think what all of us would like to see is the community be able to come together across areas and say, this is what we want for our community. And then government respond to that and say, okay, we need money for these particular things. And then find corporations to be able to come in and do those projects and kind of build from the need up. And so I think that is definitely a path that we need to work on more. Of course, that doesn't always align with profit. And so that's why usually there's a need for government to come in and help bridge the finances for that. And that's just being practical, right? Like the money has to come from somewhere. And so being able to get that to come in is usually the need of the government, of the nonprofit sector, of foundations. And we were trying to recruit that type of money in as well from foundations, to be quite frank. So I put in the Regional Energy Democracy Initiative, which is something worth people checking out. What we were trying to create in there is a regional plan across the Gulf South from 5 different localities for people to say, these are the types of benefits we actually want and need in our community. Then we were going to play some matchmaking with the DOE projects that we had in the area to see which of those needs from the community could actually be resolved by the projects that were coming in, and then identify the gap between the needs and what DOE was able to provide, and had an economic development entity in there to be able to seek funding to be able to go and develop those projects. And so it was only partially DOE. We were kind of like building that base and a launching pad really for the communities. And unfortunately, that program got canceled by the Trump administration. But it is still worth a structure that I think is worth looking at. It addresses a lot of the capacity issues that Daniel was talking about as well. We had legal services, economic services, technical assistance, labor, and then communities partnering in a consortium model. So it might be worth taking a look. Also, I think it's maybe obvious from this conversation, but CBPs are not a substitute for consent. And so I think that was the problem for the DOE element, was that we were trying to redirect benefit based on Justice 40. That was our authorization, was Justice 40, right? We didn't have, it wasn't trying to prevent projects that could potentially cause harm or redirect what kinds of projects or shape what the project function was, right? And so that's the part that was the missing link in all of this, was that it wasn't necessarily a project the community requested. So I think that mechanism still needs to be developed and modeled and implemented. And CBPs are fantastic. Once you decided to go forward with a project, then do the CBP and do the CBA project, but have a different mechanism that better suits for consent for projects. And then lastly, which is in all projects, is just making sure that the impacted community members and the most impacted are there during design development, which is even before, or project development, which is the step before project design. And usually they start to come at the end of design, but they really need to be there during development. And and one other thing, just for people to remember, is we did create these CBP roundtable, like a toolkit for people to utilize, and that was probably still available from the Boston Museum of Science, because we developed it in concert with them, and we put it into Collective Commons. And so it was a really useful toolkit. It's like a tabletop exercise, almost like a game, for people to develop community benefit plans.
Thank you, Sunrisa. And I know we're a couple minutes over, but Daniel, did you have anything in closing to add?
I want everything Sunrisa just said. No, I mean, I think the big takeaway for me, for this last 4 years is, despite all of the, the tumultuous nature, like the main thing is still the main thing. And that is organizing communities to understand who they are, what they want, to develop a project pipeline, to encourage civic participation, to grow more inclusive and democratic processes, to attract principled and mission-aligned investors. If we're working consistently to do those things and resourcing those things, that's going to produce the kind of world that I want my kids to grow up in, I suspect. And this was a masterclass in reminding us of all of those sorts of things. I think, the other key takeaway is that, policy matters, right? I mean, we need to look back at what worked and what didn't work and have these kinds of conversations and, take another whack at this thing in a future administration, perhaps. And I think if we see this as an opportunity to reflect meaningfully and really in a disciplined way on both the wonderful things that happened and the things that could have been better, I think the process will produce wonderful benefits at some point in all kinds of interesting ways.
Thank you. And thank you all very much for all of your thoughts, experience. A lot of it is captured in the brief. Many contributions were made by each of these speakers, but this was really a wonderful conversation, just scratched the surface. And I thank everyone for participating and thank you panelists again for all of your insights. Everyone take care and have a great holiday.